So this is just a review of the things that go on during the Reagan administration. And so we're going to talk about Reagan's like foray into Lebanon in a little bit. And we've already talked about SDI, which stands for Strategic Defense Initiative. Good. But I want to talk about a couple of others. Just really briefly, there was the whole invasion of Grenada. So there was a revolution in Grenada, and they were communists, obviously. And they overthrew the government, and we didn't like that. And so, but we didn't like have any reason to go to war with him, exactly. So we sent a rescue mission to rescue, I don't know, like 20 some odd American medical students who were studying at a hospital there. Our rescue mission happened to include a couple of divisions of U.S. Marines, and made a slight diversion on the way to the hospital to rescue those students, and instead like deposed the new leader guy they had rebelled against, and like helped to they just made a little mistake. They got lost and didn't know what to do, and they met a dictator. And anyway, so that was Grenada, and nobody cared. They were like, woohoo, go America. I mean, people cared, but like nobody in America was concerned about like our violating the sovereignty of another country or anything like that. So a nice little yay. Okay, and then there's the Iran-Contra affair. I'm going to try to explain this to you with a straight face, but I'm not sure I'm going to be able to, so good luck to me. So the Iran-Contra affair has to do with Nicaragua, and I've written how to spell Nicaragua over there on the board in the corner. It's underlined, Nicaragua. So Nicaragua is a country in which part of the world? No, it's Central America. Good. It's geography. Okay. So Nicaragua is a country in Central America. And there had been a revolution years past, like in the 70s, I think, that had established a communist-led government in Nicaragua. They were called, the group of people that were in power, like their party, they were called the Sandinistas. So that's how it spells it over there, Sandinistas. They're communists. So the Sandinistas are a bunch of communists, is that my phone? That are in charge of Nicaragua. Hold tight. Okay, so the Sandinistas control Nicaragua, but they're commies, and they're in our own backyard, and we don't like that. So we began to send a whole bunch of money and weapons and like CIA operatives to help this like opposition group, this rebel group in Nicaragua who was trying to get rid of the Sandinistas. They are called the Contras, and if you speak Spanish, you understand why that is incredibly ironic and also super unoriginal, because it literally just means against. So it's like we're the against the people. I don't know. Anyway, so we begin to fund the Contras. Here's the thing, though. I mean, the Contras are actually, like, ruthless criminals. So, I mean, they oppose this communist government, and also they kill people who disagree with them, and steal and rob stuff in order to get more funding, and they're just generally bad guys. So, pretty soon, the American press gets wind of America's funding, ruthless, bloodthirsty criminals, and Congress gets a little bit upset, saying we weren't consulted and we do not give you permission to give money to the Contras, and they pass a law that literally says you cannot give money to the Contras. That's the entire point of the law. Do not give money to the Contras. So the Reagan administration is faced with a puzzle. They want to get rid of this communist Sandinista government. The Contras are the best way to do that, but they've been forbidden from giving them any money. And the government, of course, will control all the money. The Congress controls all the money. So they thought about it for a while, and then they came up with a brilliant plan. Okay. So you know how we can't give any money that Congress gives us to the Contras, right? Right, but if we could get some money that they never suspected we would have, then we could use that money however we wanted, right? Right. So why don't we, what do we have a lot of? Weapons. Why don't we sell weapons to somebody they'd never suspect that we would give weapons to? How about Iran? They had hostages for more than a year, and they regularly protest in the streets chanting death to America. Sounds like the perfect cover. No one would ever suspect. So let's sell weapons to our stated enemies, the Iranians, and then with the money that no one will ever suspect that we have, let's give it to the Contras, the bloodthirsty criminals getting rid of those gosh darn communists in Nicaragua. What do you say? That's the Chinese from America. And that's exactly what they did. They actually, I didn't make that up, y'all. They actually did that. And then Congress finds out and is fairly upset. And so some people thought that Reagan was going to be impeached because this was clearly criminal activity. But Reagan was never implicated. Some people called him the Teflon president because nothing stuck to him, you know. So he always, basically his like leadership style was very hands off. He was like, listen, I'm like the president, but I delegate to people and I don't ever like ask them to check in with me, so I didn't know what they were doing, sorry. This guy Oliver North like takes most of the blame and gets criminally prosecuted and whatever. But that is the Iran-Contra scandal in a nutshell. There you go. Right, and then last but not least, the Reagan-Gorbachev summits. This you already kind of know, which is that Reagan is going to meet with, who is Gorbachev? Yeah, the Soviet premier, the new one. He's the one who's coming as the Soviet Union's falling apart. The economy is absolutely collapsing in the Soviet Union, not in small part because the U.S. has kind of forced them to spend more on the defense than they can actually afford to spend. And so Gorbachev and Reagan, they have a bunch of like, talks, which don't really come to much because neither of them are willing to make like a lot of concessions. But it is important that we're like having this communication. Gorbachev visits the U.S. and gets like a hero's welcome in the U.S. Time names him Man of the Year because he's like liberalizing Russia, which is seen as being like a really big deal. But anyway, okay, there's that. Now I have approximately 25 minutes in which to give you a brief history of the Middle East. Good luck to us all. All right, so this is review, which we've already talked about, but just to give you a reminder that most of America's involvement in the Middle East centers around the country of Israel, which was created in 1947 by an order of who? The United Nations, following the end of World War II, except for that Israel occupies territory that was previously occupied before them. And so the Palestinians, Arab Muslims primarily, who are living in that territory do not take super kindly to their land being reappropriated. What's the United phrase? Reaccommodated. For another group of people who are also like sort of their sworn enemies. Anyway, so we begin to have conflicts. There's war almost immediately. The U.S. supports Israel in that conflict. That's 1947. Then the PLO, it stands for the Palestinian Liberation Organization. The Palestinian Liberation Organization. They still exist today, and the U.S. classifies the PLO as a terror group. But the PLO says that they are merely representatives of the true government of the territory they call Palestine, and the U.S. calls Israel, and it gets really complicated like that. Anyway, so the PLO organizes in the 1950s and begins to engage in what the United States and most people would consider terror activities. So they do have political organization, but also they send people, suicide bombers and like assassins missions to basically try to disrupt Israeli politics. And they're reasonably good at it. Then in the 50s and early 60s, the government of Syria, you can see here, so Syria shares a small border with Israel. Syria begins to like encourage raids of various militant groups to try to like harass Israel. This means that Israel spends what? A lot on defense or not very much? A lot. The Israeli military is a huge like part of the identity of the Israeli government because they are literally surrounded by their enemies at all times. So there's that. Then the Six-Day War, which we talked about before, is when Iraq, Syria, Egypt, and Jordan all attack Israel at the exact same time. And with the United States' help, what happens? Israel wins. They don't just win, they like win and take over a whole bunch of territory. The Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and so on. So the U.S. is like, okay, Israel, we should probably cool it off a little bit. Maybe you should give some of that land back. And they give some of it back, but it doesn't get much better. In the 70s, Nixon's Secretary of State Henry Kissinger suggests that we should not like get too caught up with Israel, that we don't want to get into like an endless conflict with the Arab countries in the Middle East, and so we should really work to just like mediate the stuff happening in the Middle East as opposed to like actively trying to intervene, which lasts approximately 5 minutes, a little more than that. But then in 1973, the Yom Kippur War is going to put Israel on the brink of defeat. So Egypt and Syria have this really strongly organized attack against the Israelis, and without the U.S.'s like active intervention, the Israelis are really beginning to struggle. So then the U.S. has to decide, like, well, do we lose our only ally in the entire Middle East, and the Soviets have several allies, or do we let them, stay out of it, not get involved and spend our money and let them fall apart? You know what we decided? We supported the Israelis in the end. They do emerge victorious again, kind of at the last minute. And this is the event that prompts the OPEC oil embargo against the U.S., which is responsible for so many of our domestic problems here. So the U.S. gets involved in that Yom Kippur War in 1973, and this prompts OPEC to declare that embargo. So then during Jimmy Carter's presidency, there's this real sense like, wow, we've kind of gotten ourselves into a big mess here. Maybe we should try to like resolve conflict in the Middle East instead of stirring it up. And so Carter's like biggest achievement, of course, comes in the Camp David Accords. Remind me what the Camp David Accords establish? Yeah, Egypt recognizes Israel's right to exist as a country. So prior to this, and still to this day, other than Egypt, although actually I shouldn't say to this day, to the last book I read, which was published about 5 years ago, Egypt is the only Arab nation to recognize the nation of Israel like as a country that has a legitimate right to exist. But the Camp David Accords don't recognize Israel's right to exist in Israel or Palestine or whatever. They just say that it is a country that exists somewhere on the planet. And so it's a little controversial still because, of course, Egypt still says that that territory belongs to Palestinians. But why is it important? It doesn't sound like it's that big of a deal. Why is it important? Why do we care that Egypt says they exist? Okay, they could be part of the UN. Okay, they get legitimacy. Okay, that's Helsinki Accords, but you're thinking about the right way. Think about it another way. If Egypt does not recognize Israel as a country and they get into a conflict ever, what solutions are the only ones possible? Military, right? You can bomb a piece of land even if you don't recognize a government being there. So if you don't recognize them as a country, can you ever like send a representative to go and talk diplomacy and try to come up with some sort of treaty or agreement? No. But if you recognize them as a country, then all of a sudden now we have diplomatic options available to us. We can maybe talk out our problems instead of just bombing each other to death. So again, it's not a huge thing. It's not like Egypt is like, absolutely, Israel, we support your right to be there, and we will make sure those Palestinians, don't blow you up or whatever. They don't do that at all. But the fact that they recognize Israel as a country means that now we have some diplomatic avenues. And although other Arab countries have not recognized Israel as a country, they recognize Egypt, right? So, for example, when Syria, used to before it all fell apart, when Syria would need to negotiate with Israel, Syria could send representatives to Egypt, and the Egyptians would then act as kind of intermediaries, right, to try to negotiate something with Israel and so on. So this was a big step forwards, but of course not perfect. Okay, so then, of course, at the end of Carter's administration, this like, yay, we're going to have peace in the Middle East, it'll be wonderful, all falls apart because of the Iranian Revolution, which happened in 1979. Tell me about the Shah of Iran. What kind of a guy was he? Well, I mean, the checklist in America for being a good guy is, do you hate the Russians? If yes, you're good to go. So was he a good guy? Absolutely. He hates the Russians. Where he likes the Americans, he lets us invest, he's a good guy. But okay, in all fairness, he is also kind of evil and kills people, so, whatever it was, the Iranian Revolution 1979 gets rid of the Shah. They place Ayatollah Khomeini in power and don't like the U.S. super much because we don't return the Shah for them to execute. And this prompts the Iranian hostage crisis and just really shows that the U.S. is not on super good terms with them. Don't worry, we'll sell you weapons in 5 years. So next, the kind of thing that comes up is the Iraq-Iran War. It starts in 1980, and I know that you guys are struggling to grasp this, but it's a war between Iraq and Iran. They share a border with one another, and they were kind of jockeying for power. Iraq and Iran are governed by two different sects of Islam, and they don't agree on a whole lot of things. And so they began this war. And the U.S. takes one look at all of this, and we go, all right, who should we support? Well, Iraq sounds like a good plan, right? They are more democratic than Iran, which is a fairly low bar to cross, but they have elections kind of. And also the Iranians captured all of our hostages, so okay, we're going to support the Iraqis. Oh, except for we're going to also secretly sell weapons to the Iranians, but that's not part of the official story. So officially we're going to support the Iraqis, and we send them weapons and money. Would you like to know who's in charge of Iraq at the time? Saddam Hussein. Might have heard of him. Saddam Hussein. So we support the Iraqis in the Iraq-Iran war, although we're also kind of supporting the Iranians for a little while because the whole Iran-Contra affair. Anyway, the war lasts for 8 long years and ends basically in a stalemate in 1988. And I feel like this is a great summary of American politics in the Middle East, sort of like darned if we do and darned if we don't, because here's the thing. Of course the Iranians hate us because we supported the Iraqis. But the Iraqis also hate us because, in their opinion, if we had wanted them to really win, we would have given them more aid. The Israelis never lost when the U.S. helped them. So if we had really wanted the Iraqis to win, we would have given them more aid, and then they could have actually won instead of having to like be defeated or have this stalemate where they didn't get anything they wanted. So pretty much everybody hates us. Moving on. Okay, now let's talk about Reagan's policies in Israel. So the Iraq-Iran War, that's during Reagan's term in office. Now Reagan has to figure out what to do about Israel. Carter had tried to, negotiate the Camp David Accords. What is Reagan going to do? Well, in the early 80s, the PLO really steps up their terror raids from Lebanon. So the PLO is mostly hiding in Lebanon. Lebanon is another Arab country that supports them. So they sort of like have their headquarters in Lebanon, and they kind of come across the border into Israel, and they blow stuff up, and they whatever. And so Israel's kind of tired of that poop. And so Israel decides they're going to invade Lebanon and find the PLO and take them out themselves. If Lebanon won't get rid of these criminals, then Israel's going to do it themselves. And so they invade Lebanon in 1982 and immediately set off the Lebanese Civil War. The government of Lebanon was mostly secular. It wasn't a theocracy. But most of the people in government in Lebanon, the ruling family, were Christian, even though Lebanon has a Muslim majority. So there was like tension in the country. And so the instability caused by the Israeli invasion sets up this civil war that lasts a really long time. And it gets really bloody, and there's worries about ethnic cleansing. And so the United Nations decides we're going to act. We've got to stop all this. And America feels particularly responsible because, it was our allies, Israel, who had kind of caused the whole thing. And so we decide we're going to send in plenty of our own troops to support the peacekeeping mission. Their purpose was just to help restore peace in Lebanon. That's all. They're not trying to change the government. It was a pretty innocuous good guy thing to do, kind of. Okay. And then one day, a truck is driven into the U.S. Army base in Lebanon, where we were set up to help the peacekeeping mission. It explodes. It was packed full of explosives, and kills more than 200 U.S. Marines. What do you think America does next? Well, actually, we withdraw. We leave. We're all done. We're not interested in getting anybody else dying. We were just here to help be nice to people. This is not worth it. And we leave. If you're interested in any of this, I strongly recommend a book. It's called The Leaning Tower. No, The Impending Tower. Not Pisa. And it's specifically about the rise of Al-Qaeda. But more broadly speaking, it traces the rise of fundamentalist Islamic terrorism in the Middle East. And does a really good job of talking about how a lot of these things get started. And it points to this event because, do you remember when we talked about appeasement before World War II? And I think I gave you the analogy of Nate in the store, and if he asks for a cookie and I say yes one time, the next time he's going to throw a fit again, and he's going to whatever. Well, what do you think the terrorists learn from this? Attack the U.S. and the U.S. will leave. That's how you get the U.S. to leave. You just kill enough Americans. You look to Vietnam. Were we ever defeated militarily in Vietnam? Did they have to have a superior army to get us out of Vietnam? No. They just bled us for a while, a long while, and then we left. So the book that I read, it's a group of scholars who are well respected in their field, and their basic argument is that the U.S. essentially created or contributed to the creation of the modern terrorist MO in our response to Lebanon. That this was one of our first experiences with this kind of action, and that withdrawing is probably the worst thing we could have done because it just sort of reaffirmed that the U.S. can be scared away. They don't actually care enough to sort of stick it out. So kind of an interesting thing. But okay, so let's fast forward now into 1990, and we're going to talk about a different set of countries. Back to Iraq, still run by Saddam Hussein, and now recently concluding the Iraq-Iran war. They are poor-ish, relatively speaking, for all that oil. They are in a lot of debt, and they're struggling economically, which is kind of putting Saddam Hussein in a weird place. Economically, even when dictatorships have a weak economy, they have to worry about dissent. So he's trying to look for something to solve. So Iraq, of course, has lots and lots of oil. They have the second largest oil deposits in the world, and so they're doing okay. But Iraq turned its eyes to Kuwait, and so Iraq shares a border with Kuwait. And in my terribly drawn drawing over here, most of Iraq's biggest oil fields are just across the border from Kuwait, and Kuwait also has some oil fields on their side of the border. And Saddam Hussein begins making the case that he believes that Kuwait was doing something called slant drilling. I find this incredible to believe, but my dad, who's an engineer, tells me it is a reality, that apparently you can drill a well, like an oil well, like straight down and then over. I don't really understand how you do that, but you can, apparently. And so Saddam Hussein was basically accusing the Kuwaitis of having oil wells on their side that drilled into Iraqi oil fields. They were stealing their oil. And Saddam Hussein demands that they pay him this ridiculous sum, and they won't do it, and so then Iraq invades Kuwait. And the Iraqi army is an incredibly powerful army. The U.S., like here in the U.S., I think we tend to kind of look around the world and be like, ha ha ha, you think you have an army. But I mean, we're the U.S., you know? But actually, the Iraqi army was really strong and really powerful. Remember, they had been fighting for 8 long years against Iran. And Saddam Hussein himself heavily favored the military, so they were really well financed. They had lots of training. They had pretty advanced weapons. Iraq has a really great army. They invade Kuwait, and Kuwait basically has like a baseball team to defend them. You know, I mean, nothing. And so the Kuwaitis fall within like 24 hours. Kuwait City is captured. There are reports of lots of atrocities. Some of them we can verify. Like they would pull men out of the houses, military-age men, the Iraqi soldiers, would pull them out of houses and line them up in the streets and execute them. So like just on the spot, no trial, no evidence, nothing. They would just execute all these people. Other stories were unsubstantiated. One of the most sensational that I remember seeing a news report about was that the Iraqi army came into a Kuwaiti hospital, and in order to make like more space or whatever, they took babies out of the maternity ward and like threw them in the air using the target practice. So that was a story coming from a refugee, that we didn't have any like verification of that happening. But it's kind of like the Spanish-American War, right? There were plenty of reports of atrocities in the Spanish-American War that we didn't confirm. The yellow press just reported on them, but it didn't really matter about reality. The country really felt like we needed to get involved. We need to stop this guy, Saddam Hussein. Never mind that we supported him for 8 years. That's okay. So the U.S. Then tries to figure out what to do, but the world isn't really ready to go to war. You know, I mean, like, Saddam Hussein has a really strong army, and the Middle East is already really volatile, and I don't know. So we're kind of all hemming and hawing. The United Nations begins to issue a series of ultimatums, which sound a lot like me talking to my children. Don't cross that line. I'm going to give you 10 seconds to get back over that line. I'm counting 10, 9, 1.5, 1, 3/4, 2/7, whatever. And so the Iraqis continue to stall. They don't cross the border. But interestingly, we get an intelligence report, several intelligence reports, that show us something very alarming indeed. Although the Iraqis are still in Kuwait, which they're not supposed to be, they're also now massing a significant number of troops just across the border, in Iraq, across the border from Saudi Arabia. Well, if the Iraqis control Iraq and Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, they'll be in control of like 3/5 of the world's oil. That's a lot. Also, although you would think that the Saudis have this really strong military because we perceive them as being really wealthy, they actually have a really weak military, almost none to speak of. So if the Iraqis decided to invade Saudi Arabia, there is no way the Saudis would be able to repulse them. And what else could the Iraqis possibly be doing if they're massing across the border from Saudi Arabia than being ready for an attack? So then begins a very complicated little dance, because the U.S. of course doesn't want this to happen. Besides the fact that we like Saudi Arabia kind of, we also really like access to oil, and we know that we don't want Saddam Hussein to control all that oil. And so we approach the Saudi government and say, hey, you need to let us come and put some troops in Saudi Arabia. You need to let us station troops across the border from Iraq to protect you, because there's no way you can protect yourself. You need us. This is kind of controversial because Saudi Arabia is also home to the 2 holiest cities in Islam. And many more traditional Muslims, especially in Saudi Arabia, believed that non-Muslims should not be in Saudi Arabia in the first place, just at all. And certainly not non-Muslim American, Israel-loving, not traditional or religious Americans like the soldiers would be. So there's immediate opposition to this, but the Saudi princes decide that although they know that it's not popular, they feel like they have no choice but to allow the Americans to come in and protect their border, and so they let us in. To our credit, the U.S. attempts to be diplomatic. So although our army is integrated isn't the word. Our army is mixed. We have both men and women serving in the military in the 1990s, and they serve in the same units. They're all ordered to wear their full uniform at all times. Most of the time in the desert, when you're in a less formal environment, they would take off their big like overshirts and have just their undershirts on or roll up their pants, but they're told to keep all of their uniform on all the times. They don't serve, like the Army mess hall doesn't serve any pork products. They don't have any alcohol allowed on base. There are all kinds of other like strict rules established to try to like reduce the impact of the Americans being there, but it doesn't really matter. The same book I told you about. They went through a whole bunch of evidence that had been seized through several like raids on Al-Qaeda safe houses, and lots of the early Al-Qaeda literature specifically references the U.S. being stationed in Saudi Arabia, like defiling this holy land by their presence, as one of the reasons why the U.S. becomes a target, right? What are you looking for? Over there behind. So anyway, we sort of mass our troops there, and then when the last UN deadline finally passes and the Iraqis have not withdrawn from Kuwait, then the U.S. leads the attack force in the military operation called Operation Desert Storm. I do want you to point out, though, we're not in it on our own. We, of course, have the majority of the troops because we have the biggest military in the world. But you should note that Bahrain, Egypt, Kuwait, Oman, Pakistan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and the UAE all are part of this coalition alongside the United States, which is important because it's not just the West against the Middle East. By 1990, at least, we had realized that if we're going to lead an army to invade, and to attack Iraq, we should make sure it doesn't look like we're just, white America versus Iraq. So there's as a coalition of Arab countries that join in. And Operation Desert Storm is really successful. We use a whole bunch of like missile attacks first and air attacks. And then we're very quickly able to drive out the Iraqis from Kuwait. But then there's a really tough decision. So we kick the Iraqis out of Kuwait, and then what? That's all we're supposed to do. But the Iraqis have the capability to re-invade Kuwait at any time. So there were many in the American army who were calling for the destruction of the Iraqi army. We do go a little bit further. So as the Iraqi army is fleeing Kuwait, all of these like big military vehicles kind of have to go along this one big highway between Kuwait City and Baghdad. And of course, there's lots of them all trying to get out at the same time, and so it ends up in this giant traffic jam. And so U.S. Fighter planes and a couple of small bombers, they bomb it's called the highway to hell is what it ended up being called, because all of these military vehicles are basically trapped, and they all get kind of bombed. So to try to reduce the military capability, but we don't pursue the Iraqi army into Iraq. And although the war turned out to be a really quick one, the American troops were really worried that the war itself was going to be catastrophic, because Iraq was highly suspected of having used chemical weapons against Iran during the Iraq-Iran war, and there were great fears that they were going to use chemical weapons against us. In the end, probably one of the things that contributed to our speedy victory was that many of the Iraqi army recruits, the people that had been forced, the draftees, they surrendered right away. They didn't even want to fight the United States. And Saddam Hussein believed that we would attack Baghdad. He believed that we wouldn't stop at the Kuwaiti border. And so he kept his best units, his best military divisions in Baghdad. And so they weren't the ones that we were fighting in any significant way. So anyway, so after Operation Desert Storm, President Bush enjoys this military victory, and the U.S. has successfully accomplished our objectives. There are those who criticize the U.S. allowing Saddam Hussein, this obvious bad guy, to stay in power. But Donald Rumsfeld, who at the time worked for President H.W. Bush, came out and was very vocal about saying, listen, there is no way that we could have concluded a war in Iraq. We could have invaded and taken out Saddam Hussein, but we'd be stuck there for years. There'd be no way, if there's no exit plan, there's no way that we can get out. So it was the right thing to do for us to stop where we were. That was the only practical choice. And so that those quotes came up then because 13 years later, then the U.S. once again found itself attacking the Iraqi government, and that time, of course, we did end up in a conflict that we are still involved in. So that is a brief history of the United States and the Middle East.